Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So, welcome back to my weekday videos where I host stimulating conversations/interviews with prominent individuals to talk about storytelling and culture. But before we get to the interview, I just want to remind everyone that the campaign for my new graphic novel, The Valiant Heroes, is still up. You can also order my first graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, from that campaign if you wish as well. You're looking at some of the spectacular art from both of those books in the background. And the early bird sign up page for my next graphic novel, Crom the Destroyer, is now up. You can sign up there so that when the campaign opens in about 6 months, you will be informed. And if you do so, you also get a free exclusive pinup poster when you purchase something from the campaign. Once again, you're looking at some of the spectacular art from Crom the Destroyer in the background from my artists, Jim O'Reilly and Mike Gustovich. As usual with all of my content, each of these stories center around my exploration of the traditional hero. Thomas Valiant and the Valiant Heroes are superhero stories, 82-page giants. Crom the Destroyer is a sword and sorcery graphic novel centered around death and honor. So if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, you might want to click on that link or both of those links in the description and go on over and see if any of my graphic novels are for you. All right, on with the interview. All right, welcome back to my weekday series where I do interviews and conversations with influential people about storytelling. And today I have with me Clifton Duncan. He is, well, an award-winning actor. I would say at the very least you've won plenty of awards at the university level, and you've done many off-Broadway plays. You have acted in various parts within Hollywood television shows and things like that. Why don't you give the audience, those who don't know you, a little bit of your repertoire, a little bit of your experience, because I know I did not realize just how much skill and award-winning acting you had done until I looked you up on IMDb and I started reading and I went, wow.
Well, that's very kind, RJ. Very happy to speak with you again after our conversation on the Clifton Duncan podcast on YouTube and Spotify. Just to correct the record, I don't want to overstate my achievements too much. I'm award nominated. I'm the bridesmaid, not quite the bride just yet. But yeah, I went to New York University's graduate acting program, which is one of the big three. The other two being Juilliard and the Yale School of Drama, aka the Yale School of Trauma. I played lead roles on many of America's most esteemed stages. I've done, like you said, plenty of award-winning shows off Broadway. I made my Broadway debut in a beloved British farce or slapstick farce called The Play That Goes Wrong. I've guest starred on several networks from Starz to to NBC, CBS, and Fox. And yeah, I've spent my over 20 years now, mostly on stage and a little bit on screen. Screen pays more. I'm also a singer. I have played in venues ranging from the small Joe's Pub in New York City to the City Center, which has about 3,000 seat venue. So I've done quite a bit. Obviously, I'm not a household name, but I have. I have some credibility. I'll put it that way, and anybody can look up what I've done. So, in a nutshell, that's what I'm about.
Well, we talked a little bit on the Clifton Duncan podcast about your connection with comic books and how you grew up with comics, and we had a discussion there. But I want to ask this question, which I usually ask all of my guests. What would be your favorite story, just to give the audience a taste of where you fit in within storytelling?
That's such a difficult question. My mind immediately went to, maybe one of my favorite plays, and then it also went to a novel. If I'm forced to pick one, and one that I'm more familiar with, it probably would be Shakespeare's Othello. Um, I think, just from a dramaturgical standpoint, the way that the play is constructed, it has great. It's a classic tragedy in a way where you have this character, this title character, who is a very high station and position. He's worked his way there up from slavery to become, a respected general in in Italy, and he falls in love with this woman named Desdemona, and a friend and confidant named Iago works throughout the entire play to undermine his relationship. And what I love about the play, in terms of its construction, I think that the jury is out on if it's his best tragedy. I think people normally say it's Hamlet or King Lear, but for my purposes, for my sake, I feel like all the principal characters, even the more minor ones, have very strong emotional needs, and they all butt up against each other in just the right way to increase the tension. And ultimately, in sort of classic Aristotelian form, there's a big revelation at the end of the play where Othello finds out that he's been lied to the entire time. This is after he's murdered his wife, and it's just it's when it's done really well, the effect is just devastating.
Well, I wanted to talk about Shakespeare in this hour. I honestly did. But I was going to say that if you were to take out, I suppose, the ancients with Homer and Hesiod, Shakespeare would probably be there on the top of my list for what storytelling that I love. Julius Caesar is one of the plays that I just am attracted to in so many ways. And honestly, I was introduced to this in high school, and I got into things like Othello for a girl and stuff like that. You know how it happens.
That's
But
how it
what I
always
wanted to,
happens for
yeah,
straight guys.
what I wanted to talk about really was how much storytelling is affected by the types of stories that are being told and the types of acting that you're going to see on screen and on the stage as well. And it's a large topic, but the reason why I wanted to talk about it because as you mentioned when we talked last time, one of the reasons why you seem to be getting out of all of the stage that you uh, have been involved in is because you are not allowed to play basically manly man characters within your range. And because of the closing of that door, you found that it wasn't as appealing to you. Is that a good summation?
Yeah, I mean, there's other reasons why I can't work right now, which have nothing to do with this podcast. But I will say that there was a point where I hit this great run where, and it's ironic because it's an industry right now which is very, very inhospitable for men and masculinity. And yet, once I got out of conservatory and I put on some muscle mass, and I also, I had a fundamental shift in my worldview and my ideas about myself. And to put it simply, I just stopped apologizing for being a man. I got a lot more work, and on top of that, what's happening right now is that I remember I asked my manager, my former manager, at one point, and why are we hiring all these Australian actors? And without missing a beat, she says, "Well, they're more masculine." So, in an industry that on one end, which is very much consumed right now with this idea of um, putting forth or highlighting, amplifying sexual minorities and women, especially. At the same time, it's sort of working at cross purposes because they are they are sort of reducing the opportunities for people who don't adhere to that. I mean, one example I can think of right off the bat is for anyone who is familiar with musical theater. I love which I a genre I really enjoy. I always say I'm about 12% gay because of my love for musical theater. Rodgers and Hammerstein, the classical musicals, two of them, Oklahoma and Carousel. I really wanted to do Oklahoma. There's a great lead role named Curly, and Hugh Jackman played it back in the day. For instance, you can still find footage of him doing it. And it's just a great role for like a sort of romantic lead with a great baritone voice. And when they did a revival in New York, it was very, very heavily postmodern and deconstructed. And because you cannot have a production in which there is such a straightforward narrative where a man is pursuing a woman, they had to add all these sort of break it, gender swapping and race swapping and everything. And I wanted to audition for it, and they wanted to put me in for the audition for the the comic relief role. And I'm like, guys, there's a lot of guys who are way, way, way funnier and who could blow this part out of the water. I'm not that person. I should be the guy who's charming and charismatic, and and can add a little bit of edge as well. Who has warmth and just everything that this role could stand for, and it just wasn't. There was just no room for that. Another example would be Kiss Me Kate, the classic Cole Porter musical, which is based on the Shakespeare play Taming of the Shrew. It's a great show because it works with, in the main characters, Fred and Lily. You have the best and the worst of the male and the female. And, Fred, he's got this big ego, sort of a braggart. And Lily is very, very temperamental and, sort of tempestuous. And the book is very clever and very witty. But if you're familiar with the play Taming of the Shrew, it's very difficult in today's very feminist society, because at the end, I mean, the title is what it is. Kate is very much a shrewish person who no man wants to marry, and Petruchio, aka Fred, Petruchio comes in all swagger and bluster and just dripping with macho masculinity, and his whole goal is to tame her. And by the end, he kind of breaks her, and she learns to submit. And so you have all these productions now that kind of try to find a way to get around that. And and it just doesn't really work. They did a revival of the play some years ago in New York, and again, I wanted to be up for that, but they cast sort of a not really strong, charismatic, powerful lead with a big presence. They had to kind of scale it back because they had to make it. They had to tip the scales, I think, in the female's favor. And so there's nothing wrong with that. It could. I'm not such a prude in that I don't think that any sort of alterations or reexamination of old material can work. I just my only caveat is that it must in some way highlight the material in some way, or elevate the material in some way, or add something new to the story, which wasn't there before. And so basically, long story short, I began to feel as though there really was no place for me, especially in the theater realm. Fortunately, that wasn't the case in the TV realm, where they still, on screen, they still value these sorts of traits. But even then, increasingly so, it's just become. It's not really about that, and yet we still hire these Australians to come in and show everyone else how to be men. But I just began to feel like, well, I'm not gay, I'm not trans, and it seems like the work in that aspect has dried up for me. And I've played gay roles before. I have no issue with that sort of a thing. I mean, my primary concern and focus has always been: is the story good? Is there something compelling about this character or this role? Do they have some kind of an interesting journey? Will an audience take something? When you read something and you encounter something that it's special, that it's powerful. You don't need like a high IQ or an Ivy League degree to know when a piece of material moves you. Even if it's as basic as I like this or I don't like it, or it's making me laugh. You know, um, and so I began to very much feel out of place, and it's not about any sort of bitterness or um, any sort of bigotry, I suppose, against anyone. It's just, well, I never got into acting to be any kind of activist. It was something I was good at, and I kept getting jobs, and it kept me out of an office. So yeah, I think I just began to feel like, where do I really fit in all of this? And it extends to like rehearsal conversations and everything, but that might be a sort of rabbit hole you don't want to go down. But I don't know if I answered your question the way that you or the way that you like. But
No, I think that's good. Off of that, although I'll have to admit to my audience right now, I'm out of my depth in talking about this kind of on stage performance and all of that, but I'll do my best to keep up with Clifton here. I'll just give you my small town take on things. I mean, when I went to high school, we read Shakespeare. I mean, in high school, we had to read at least half a dozen plays from Shakespeare. You got more credit if you read more. Part
mm,
of what we had to do was, I think it was Romeo and Juliet. We had to be in the play for that. I mean, there was no question about it. Shakespeare was a mainstay within high school life. It just was. And I have found out, during the course of my channel, that things like that have been slowly since I was in high school a while ago, um, degrading to the point where they're taken out of the curriculum. And one of the things I ran across when I was doing my examination of Marvel podcasts was I was examining Marvel Studios and their connection with Scholastic. And one of the things that I found out was that what Marvel is doing is they're creating plays off of their new characters, like Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, or Squirrel Girl, or the new version of Loki, and they're taking those plays and selling them to schools so that they have something to replace the old plays with, so that they can have new representation and all this kinds of things, which is what New
Oh
Marvel
my
is all about.
gosh.
So I see that coming from the bottom, as to say they're introducing it into schools. But if I'm listening to you correctly and hearing what you have to say, both here and in the last time we talked, you're saying that it's a top down as well as a bottom up thing that's happening. The disappearance of these old great plays is something that is not happening by chance, but it's happening through really a directed way of going about telling stories.
Well, I mean, you have to also understand that, and back when I was of this sort of mindset, my training, my actor training at conservatory at NYU, I remember going through a period of feeling as though, I mean, it's a 3-year program, so I had these phases. The first phase, the first year was like, I had to sort of any idea of a black identity, I sort of tried to push to the side because I didn't want to be like the black guy who can like sing and like rap and all that stuff because I didn't want to conform to what I thought were stereotypes. And I was really paranoid about how I was perceived by other white people and by my black peers. My second year, I was sort of really really angry, and that was, I think, when I was very much like, this is a very Eurocentric Um, program and education system or whatever. But so this was back in, between 2006 and 2009. But since then, there have been more and more concerted efforts to do what they call the decolonization of the curriculum. So there is an element there is a very concerted effort to include more diverse voices, as you were saying, more representative, more representation, but it's at the expense of the Greeks, the great European playwrights, because it's too embarrassing for people that these works are so venerated. And the problem with that is that I think you're sort of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It's fine if you want to introduce, for instance, one of the changes in the program after I left at NYU. We used to study commedia dell'arte, as part of our movement and movement class and movement/games, and it's a really fascinating sort of mode of expression where you're learning how to improv, and you're taking on all these classic tropes, and you learn how to use your body in different ways and express yourself in ways that are very unusual in real life. But in terms of when you're crafting a performance on stage, it widens your toolbox as far as what you're able to use to express yourself and to illuminate characters in a way that audiences can really remember, which is our job. It's our job to really entertain and compel audiences, and to use our bodies, our voices, our temperament, our intellect, our emotional life, our imagination, to achieve those ends. So you can, but now instead of commedia, there's more like South African gumboot dancing, which I don't really have an issue with. Again, it's another mode of expression. Um, it's just sort of cynically applied, I think, in a way. I don't know the what are the costs and versus benefits of getting rid of the old like Italian clowning greats, for instance, and replacing them with the sort of more percussive form of expression, in terms of movement, in terms of learning how to use your body to inhabit different modes of expression. Again, it is that is effective, but as you were alluding to before, yeah, there is an effort by many of these programs to move away from like the trope of dead white European males, and try to find more representation. The problem with that is that the people that they're trying to eliminate, the work that they're trying to get rid of and hide is really, really good. And I'm someone who says, you don't have to be a slave to tradition. You don't have to be a slave to the classics, so to speak. But um, if I'm reading, I recently read Prometheus Bound, Aeschylus, and a lot of the old Greek works, are a little rough around the edges. But even within that work, the relationships that play out among the characters are there. There's so much richness and depth that you could explore as an actor there. There's the size of the language is there, and this sort of gets to put a pin in that statement because I'll come back to it in just a second. But you have this material which is just pulsating with life and size and scope. And again, I reference Aristotle again. Everyone should read Aristotle's Poetics, and you have these poets, they call them poets, we call them playwrights, who were reflecting their society at the time. They were serving as a mirror, and they were unencumbered by political correctness. And so they could actually tell the truth and about who we are, the ugliness about who we are. I'm thinking of Hippolytus, for instance, that story where the titular character is killed, or he dies, I should say, as a result of a false rape allegation from his stepmother, who was in love with him. So all the kind of nitty gritty Game of Thrones kind of stuff that that I say all the time. If you like Game of Thrones, you will love Shakespeare, you'll love the Greek tragedies. So there's a capacity for people to understand that, but um, the bigger problem with that, and one of my big concerns is that I wonder if I've wondered for a long time if we even have a culture now that could produce another Olivier, another Richard Burton, Redgrave, James Earl Jones, John Gielgud, like the great actors of the 20th century, Denzel Washington, even a young Ken Branagh. Um, and part of the reason is that if you remove these works from the curriculum of actor training, then you remove the challenge that young students will face by having to expand themselves to fill these epic roles. I mean, one example I can think of is we were assigned in my text and speech class one of the Greek messenger speeches. Now, anyone who knows these plays knows that there's always this character that comes in, who's a messenger, and that literally his name is Messenger, the character, and they have these like 2-page long monologues talking about some events that have happened off stage, and I'm thinking of God, what's the play? The Persians, I think, is a good example where you have there's a war going on off stage, but you don't get to see any of that, but the war itself and its results, its impact, are conveyed through language on stage, right? And so you need performers who have the skill set to really activate that language, to really make it live, and to really communicate the immediacy, the urgency, and the emotional toll of these stories to the audience, and make it really compelling and riveting. And very few people can do that now. And even back then, when I was in school, and again, this was at this point nearly 15 years ago, Jesus, you are dealing with. I mean, I had teachers who said, the more, we're more married to these devices, our phones I'm holding up, for those who are listening. So we're pulled down, we're always facing, these screens, and we're communicating digitally, but we're not communicating orally. And consequently, that musculature required to use language in a persuasive way, and to use your own sort of emotional tool set to fill it up is really vanishing. And I think the result is that as the artists become smaller, the work becomes smaller. When the work becomes smaller, it lessens the capacity to reach an audience. And one of the great acting teachers, Stella Adler, who's her most famous students are guys like Mark Ruffalo, Warren Beatty, and particularly Marlon Brando. Um, she always wrote about size. As artists, you're stepping on the stage, it's a big platform, you're stepping into a tradition that is thousands of years old. You better have something to say. You better have some kind of presence there that compels an audience to draw their attention to you. And then once you open your mouth, you better, you need to have power. She would say, she wrote down that you need to have power at a time when people don't want you to have it. And I think the more that we decolonize these curriculums and we rob people of the ability to study and explore and live within these great works, it diminishes us as a culture and a society. And but it also, just on a mechanical level, it diminishes our capacity to really embody the larger, more epic, if you will, aspects of humanity and human nature. And so I don't want to, and I think we can all kind of feel that as a culture, is that, we see actors now that they're not really interesting, they're sort of boring. Even live plays, live shows, it's like, yeah, they sound nice, I can understand the words they're saying, they might sing pretty, they might be competent dancers, they might be convincing in whatever role they're playing, but there's a spark missing. And there's a sort of diminished presence there that just doesn't really grab you. And I want to be grabbed as an audience, metaphorically speaking, obviously. And I think part of the reason is that there's such a big focus on including everyone, that we're excluding really, really the greats. And I think that's going to just have deleterious effects down the road.
So you touched on a number of things that I wanted to bring up and questions that I had. One of them being that, well, I'll give you a little background. When I was doing my master's program, I was studying the Greeks, and basically I was studying classical political theory, and I was going through basically everything written in Greek before Aristotle, and trying to
Mhm.
trace the origins of inspiration. To say that it came through, your myths, and then into religion, into storytelling with Homer and Hesiod, and then into history, then into the playwrights, and then you get into the philosophers. But they're all trying to do the exact same thing. They're all trying to understand the universe and the systems, the
Mhm.
greater systems around them, through this inspiration, through looking at things that drew them out of themselves. And you touched on that here, talking about the ancient Greek playwrights. And I agree, they do that extremely well. And that's one of the things that I think that modern stories, especially the modern stories that we see around us today, that's what's missing. It's because it's not drawing you out of yourself. It's asking you to go deeper into yourself. That's again what you just talked about. Rather than looking upwards towards something greater, you're looking downwards all the time. But I find that again, I have listened to a number of people speak on this subject, and part of that is not just what is being presented on the stage, but the type of acting itself that is being presented to you on the stage. So I wanted to ask you, because I know that there is really, I think it would be the most pervasive method of acting today, but you could correct me on that if I'm wrong, is what is called the Stanislav system. Is that something that you're aware of as a term, or trained in? It's more of a to bring everything out from within yourself, rather than to study and to put on the cloak of the culture and all of the outside greater forces that go into making a character.
Well, there's been long debate over this. So you're referring to the great Russian theater maker and director Konstantin Stanislavski, who is widely credited with popularizing and sort of, I guess, mainstreaming what's known as the method acting, and bringing it to America. I think a lot of his work has been misunderstood. Um, he His work is good in that it requires a rigorous approach to the script. It's script analysis. You're breaking every scene down. He calls them beats, or bits. But moment to moment, line by line, even, you're asking yourself, who am I? Who is my character? What do they want? What time of day is it? What happened before the scene began? What happens between the scenes when I'm not on stage? What's my character's background? What is their main overall objective? What is their objective within a scene? So to really boil it down, it's essentially, it's sort of a very heady. It can be a very heady process, but he I guess I can summarize it as a conscious process to achieve unconscious results. On the other end of the spectrum, you had someone like Michael Chekhov, for instance, who was the nephew of the great Russian playwright Anton Chekhov. This is one of my top three favorite writers. And Michael Chekhov's, his approach was, I think, kind of ahead of his time in a way, a little bit more mystical, much more body mind, using the imagination, sort of cultivating your imagination and your creative persona, your creative individuality, he called it. One of his most famous innovations is called the psychological gesture, with acting. Whereas with Stanislavski, you might say, oh, as an actor, you're going through the script and you're saying, what's my subtext? Meaning, I'm saying these lines, and but what am I thinking underneath? What's my internal life? This sort of references what you were talking about. So there's very much a focus internally, and that has its uses, especially in modern plays, but also in older plays like Shakespeare's works. But the thing about Shakespeare is that a lot of the stuff is sort of there on the page. There's debate even there about whether subtext in Shakespeare is useful. But the thing is that because, like you were saying before, it can be more of an internal approach. And one of the great debates was between Lee Strasberg, who founded the Actor Studio, and he was very much a proponent of what's known as emotional recall, or sense memory, whatever it's called. I forgot what it's called, but and that is where you dive into your own life experience and use your own emotions in order to provide the inner life for your character, your character's emotions. And the issue with that is that once you go inside yourself and to generate some kind of emotion, you're going outside the play, you're going outside the scene, you're removing yourself from the moment that's happening in front of that's happening in front of you. And also you run the risk of really tripping on some sort of past traumas and damaging yourself in that way. So at the other end of the spectrum is I shouldn't say the other end of the spectrum, but then you had Stella Adler, who famously said once Strasberg died, she went to her class and she said, let's have a moment of silence for the death of Lee Strasberg. It'll take 100 years to undo the damage he's done to the craft of acting. So the thing about acting, though, which people don't really understand, is that as self-centered and sort of vain and narcissistic as the craft admittedly is, every single piece of every credible teacher is like, it's really all about your scene partner. You always have to be outside of yourself. Don't focus too much on like do all the work, the preparatory work, beforehand, the analysis, the breaking down of the characters, understanding like the time period you're in, your character's social class, their level of education, do they have any disabilities, do they have any diseases, do they, all the sort of what we call given circumstances of the story and of the scene. And once you know all of that and you've internalized it all, you've done your research, I had a teacher who said that information is inspiration. So you're filling yourself, basically. You're filling yourself up with all of this stuff, all this information. And that could be researching art from the time period, or maybe stimulating yourself sensorially, through scents and smells and stuff like that. But once you've done all that work, trust it. And then when you're in the scene and you're working, you're rehearsing, you're finding ways to get outside of yourself. You've done the work, and so you know who the character is, and now it's time to play with your other scene partners who hopefully have also done the work. But the problem is, there's a famous book called Audition by a guy named Michael Shurtleff, and he said 80% of actors are lazy. And that's true. That's why they become actors. And it's a fact. Come on, but it's true, so when you meet someone who's working on that level, it's very, very exciting to bounce back and forth with them. And you can create very, very exciting moments for an audience. But it should always be about what's outside of you, as you were saying before. But part of the issue what's happening now is that there's such a focus on identity, and it's about you know there's this weird sort of balance you have to strike between wanting to be seen and needing to be seen. You know what I mean? And I feel like there's more of a focus now on needing to be seen, which is a sort of weak place to be, versus wanting to. Versus what I had a teacher. We coined the phrase "the arrogance of generosity," which is you have to be arrogant enough as an artist to presume that what you have to offer is even worth looking at. But at the same time, there's a generosity in sharing it with an audience. It has to cost you something when you're doing it. A great example I can think of is the great black playwright August Wilson, one of the most revered playwrights, who passed away maybe around 2009 or so. But he was very unique in that he's writing plays about ordinary people, usually black people, and the language in his plays is I would say is almost Shakespearean in terms of its size, but the way his plays unfold is kind of Chekhovian in that they're very kind of slice of life. But he in an interview he wrote about how sort of his process, and he says, my characters talk to me, and he says, I write selfishly for myself. But when he goes into talking about his process, these characters are talking to me and I'm writing furiously. And once I'm done, I feel spent. I'm exhausted. And or Eugene O'Neill, the great playwright, the great American playwright from the early to mid 20th century. I mean, this guy, you look at a story, a play like Long Day's Journey into Night, which is made into a very memorable film with Katie Hepburn. This epic play, widely considered one of the greatest American plays written. It's very heavily autobiographical, and he exhausted himself. He worked himself to the bone to get this play out of him. So the great artists, yes, they are working selfishly, and there's an arrogance that they might have something to say that might be compelling to us, but at the same time, what they're doing is they're giving us a piece of their souls in order to for, I won't say to entertain us, but to move us in some way. And so that's what you need. And when you focus too much on, I'm this race, or I'm this gender, or I'm this sexual minority, when that becomes the focus, it stops being about, what's my scene partner doing? It stops becoming about what does the public need? What can I share? It just becomes about look at me, look at me, look at me, look at me. And there's a funny story about that, actually. I mean, it's like why there's a story when sort of a side note, and then I'll shut up. But Laurence Olivier and Dustin Hoffman were working on the film Marathon Man, and for those who don't know, that's the famous scene where there's a scene where Hoffman is strapped to a chair, and Olivier is playing this doctor who's like, picking around at his teeth, and he's like, "Is it safe? Is it safe?" And you have to go watch it. It's so like blood curdling. It's so good. But apparently Dustin Hoffman, who's very, very neurotic, and I love him as an actor, but very neurotic, and he was like, "Why, Larry?" Sir Larry is like one of the greatest, most celebrated actors of the 20th century, and he's like, "Why do we do it? Why do we put ourselves through this? Why do we do what we do?" And apparently, and they're in a restaurant, and apparently Olivier leans over the table and gets in Hoffman's face and just goes, "Look at me, look 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 at me." So there is there is an element there, but I think again, Olivier was a very, very audacious, a very bravura performer, and who's often denigrated now in many of these conservatories for being too big, too bold, too broad. But I mean, I feel like not Americans. I feel like people kind of would love a return of that kind of big, actors who aren't afraid to be that size, like a James Earl Jones, or there's another black actor named Charles Dutton, who took Broadway by storm in the 80s with working on plays by August Wilson, as a matter of fact, or James Earl Jones, again, another play. He originally did Fences, on Broadway. The play was written around him, the role of Troy Maxon. So, there is a once the focus becomes too internal and too self-centered, you're cutting out the audience from that, I think, in my opinion. And I think there's sort of a cultural shift that's happened where it's become more about look at me and the fact that I'm here, as opposed to and what I can do, as opposed to like let me move you, the general public.
Well, there's plenty I want to say off of that, but just right off the bat, I want to say that you're quite right. Even I, when I write my scripts, yeah, it's a selfish thing to do. I mean, I am entertaining myself to some extent, although I am trying to entertain other people as well. And one funny thing about that is one of the first pieces of real writing that I ever did. Again, was in high school when we were going through Shakespeare. We had to do multi, I guess, genre essay on work, and I picked Julius Caesar, and I had to write an entirely new scene for Julius Caesar in iambic pentameter. So those are the kinds of
Mm,
things that we had to do in high school. But back to what you were talking about, and what you were trying to describe there, and it's the fact that I wanted to bring out the idea because I've heard other people speak about this in the method of acting, the Stanislavski method, the method acting, basically, as most people would understand it, is that older actors were able to put on a role in a much different way because of they were reflecting what the audience actually wanted, because the audience lived in a much more we'll just say restricted sort of classical way of thinking, a way of living. You lived in a certain class, you were a man or a woman, you were expected to do things, and it was part of your life. And really, I think that goes all the way back to what I was talking about with the Greeks, and they're trying to understand things through inspiration. It's that all these class things that sat upon your life as a normal person, you knew you acted a certain way in public, you acted a certain way in private, you did certain things, you spoke certain ways, you didn't say certain things in front of certain people. Your audience understood that. And so the playwrights and the people that were presenting it, which were the actors, knew that. And so they could present their acting in that way, and it wouldn't seem stiff at all at any point to such an audience, because they realize that, yes, you're acting according to social norms. I understand that. And so that's the kind of acting, the old school of acting, as I understood it anyways, that preceded what Stanislavski wanted to get into with his internal method acting. And so my question, well, I guess it would be a double question. I don't know how much we could answer that either of them today, but I'll see if we can try. Number one being that, um, do you think that what we see today, whereas I would say in that older school of acting, you saw the actors and the playwrights reflecting what they saw in society, but as we see in so much entertainment today, it's more them trying to direct society with the way that they a write a play, and B, want the acting to be expressed in an emotional way to direct their audience towards a more emotional outburst and a more emotional life. Is that a directing force, or is it something that they're following within society itself? And the other question I would have is the fact that if the audience is naturally moving towards this more emotional interpretation, a Stanislavski method of method acting, and seeing that only on the screen now, do they even have really the internal understanding of what to do to understand these older plays like Shakespeare, and to really get what is at the heart of the message of older kinds of playwrights?
well, firstly, I think what the perhaps one of the major differences is, I mean, I don't know if I can really speak to, styles of acting. I mean, I mean, the way it kind of works is you have a piece of material, and, and you audition and you find actors that you feel like can best fit within the director's and producer's vision of how to how to best bring that material to life. So, whatever the acting style is, I mean, style is always a different thing. You know what I mean? So you'll act your acting approach stylistically will be different if you're doing Chekhov versus if you're doing, Arthur Miller, or if you're doing August Wilson or Clifford Odets, one of the other classic playwrights, or Shakespeare. It's just going to be different. Or Moliere. It's a different kind of style. So and part of the joy and fun of an actor, and I think the joy for the audience, is seeing. That's why I always want to do. I've always wanted to do rotating repertory, which is like, you see an actor in a role in one night, and then the next night they're in a completely different role, and they're still just as powerful. And it's just fun to be sort of transformational. Although on a side note, I hear that you can no longer say transformational acting because it's offensive to certain sexual minorities. But the broader picture, I think, is that older, perhaps the older playwrights were more writing within. They were holding up a mirror to a world that we recognized, and they were mirroring society. Excuse me, mirroring society as opposed to trying to improve society or engineer it in some way, which is what you were referring to. Um, and it again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before, is that, the more this kind of work gets done, the lesser demand there will be for actors who can fill the who can fulfill those old roles. And I think on top of that, going back to this idea of mirroring society, I think because there has been such a push, an ideological push in one direction, audiences are sort of they're seeing, they're having a society reflected back to them that they can't recognize, archetypes they can't recognize, that aren't familiar to them. And just to return it back to Othello, there was a production at the small theater here in the States, um, where there was a sort of, I guess there was like a non-binary person playing the role of Othello. It was a biological woman, but it was, non-binary Othello. And the thing about that play is that very deeply, I mean, it's very heavily about the war in the military. These guys are all in the army. That, they're all soldiers and generals and officers and whatnot. And I think for me, a big part of the play is the camaraderie among soldiers and the trust. I mean, trust is a heavy theme in that play, and how that trust is broken. And but when you have a sort of genderless, non-binary, like 5'9" person, it doesn't, in that last scene when Othello is murdering his wife, I mean, he's choking her to death. There was a production recently at the National Theater, and I forgot who the woman who choreographed the violence was, but she was very, very good. It was so visceral and it was so hard to watch. That's what you want, to see this big man wrapping his hands around the small woman. And like I said before, every character in that play has a strong emotional need. And so Desdemona has been working the entire play to try to, on behalf of Michael Cassio, and to preserve her marriage. But she finds at a certain point that, she knows she's going to die. And it's just so sad. It doesn't have the same impact, the same visceral impact on an audience to see some sort of 5'8" genderless person with, like, no musculature, choking, or playing at suffocating, or smothering, or throttling, this actress who's probably not that much bigger. It's like, dude, just throw the bitch off. Like, how are you not fighting back? And what I'm getting at there is that there is a visceral response that we have as humans, I believe, when we see men committing violence toward women. There's just something about it that just strikes us in a certain way. And if you eliminate that in pursuit of trying to say, oh, because again, like I said before, it illuminates nothing about the story or the material to have this non-binary person, other than to say, look, we have a non-binary person. Pay attention to what we're doing here. Nothing changes about the story. It's just we're supposed to suspend our disbelief and go along with it. And so I think the broader point I'm getting at is that what part of what we're witnessing is a failure to reflect the world as it is, and more of a desire to shape the world into what these people prefer it to be. And it's not, and I say all the time, it's not as though there's no social utility, or that you can't impact people and inspire people to change and do something with your work. It's just, once, if that overwhelms the story craft, then you're shooting yourself in the foot. And I think whether you're talking about the theater, or you're talking about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or most recently, Velma has, I didn't think it was as bad as everyone else is saying it is, but I see why they're upset. It creates a very, very alienating effect on the audience, and it's very divisive, and it's off-putting, and people. even if they can't articulate why that is, they know something is not quite right. And I think that's why we're sort of, I mean, Americans, and Camille Paglia has stated this before, I think really brilliantly, we're sort of a more utilitarian society anyway. So you had playwrights like Arthur Miller or August Wilson, who are writing plays about regular people in extraordinary circumstances. And those plays, they've they had great impact. I think they will outlive. Um, they'll last a long time. They'll hold up. But I can't think of anything written in the past 10 years which will be doing 100 years from now. Kind of went on a
Well,
tangent
that
there, but
no, but you just touched on my next question. Actually, I was listening to you, and I was wondering, really, because for me, I've always been a story junkie, and I grew up watching really, really old movies just all the time, and a lot of them were based on stage plays, things like Arsenic and
Mhm.
Old Lace or Harvey and things like that. But since you have your ear to the ground, closer to this than anyone else that I would ever know, is there anybody at this present time who is doing things like I'm trying to do, and other people are trying to do a grassroots movement where there is a concentration on, well, I don't want to say Americana, but more of a Norman Rockwell kind of reflection of a positive picture of America that's actually writing plays right now that will actually be produced?
Well, we'll see that. Well, that's the question. Will it be produced? Because I'm not someone who's very gloom and doom about arts. I used to kind of be. They say subsequent generations, the older generations say, "Oh God, they're ruining everything." But there's a lot of great work that's happening right now from a lot of wonderful people. And so I have no doubt that out there somewhere, there is someone somewhere who is crafting these great kinds of plays. The question, of course, becomes: are those plays going to get produced? And largely, from what I see, the answer is no. There are some theaters around the country, and I've had people get in contact with me, just because I mean, they're programming seasons that are less about sort of what they call issue plays and more sort of classics. And those classics could mean anything from you're doing Aristophanes to like My Fair Lady. You know what I mean? Um, but the question is, can those plays get produced? And I think largely the answer is no. And some theaters, I mean, I got some internal intel from the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, for instance, one of the most revered theaters in the country. A lot of great work happens there. It's a repertory company, and they just do great work there, or at least they did, until they decided they were going to go really, really, really deep into these sort of quote unquote progressive politics. And so now, they're having huge staff turnovers. They've lost so much money. And my spy on the inside over there, who is very much part of the Portland scene, the Oregon scene, says, yeah, people are just going to other states now to go see great shows because they're tired of what they're seeing. The same thing is happening on Broadway right now, every couple of weeks now. And part of it is because of certain major public health emergencies or the response to them over the past couple of years. But part of it is also just the programming. In terms of why audiences are not coming back to the volume that they were before everything went to crap because of this particular virus. And, it's just, I don't know how they're going to be able to steer the ship around, because it would be nice if the kind of work that you were talking about um, were produced. I will say, I mean, there are certain playwrights. I mean, there's a woman named Lynn Nottage who, I revere her as one of our great living writers right now. She's won a Pulitzer Prize twice. Her plays like Intimate Apparel, for one, which starred a young Viola Davis when it premiered off Broadway in the early 2000s. It's set in I want to say the 30s, about this black woman. She's a seamstress, and it's all these different characters from different backgrounds, and it's just a wonderful play. It's a really, really great play. There's another one that she wrote called Ruined, which is set in a bar slash brothel in Congo, and the subject matter is very horrific, and I know she's called it a feminist play, but it's such an achingly human play. that you in ways oddly and in ways oddly life affirming. That when we did it in Washington D.C. afterwards, everyone in the audience, no matter where they came from, no matter what their backgrounds were, their faces were raining. They were so deeply moved and electrified by what they had just seen. So Lynn Nottage, is a great writer. She recently did a play called Sweat, which took Broadway by storm, and it's set in Pennsylvania in a very working class community, and it's about, if I recall correctly, it's been a while since I've read it, but factories and everything have left this particular community, and people are dealing with the fallout from that. And I thought to myself, why has it taken so long for a play like this to hit Broadway? Instead, what you get a lot of times is plays about a bunch of, and not to make it about race, but a bunch of like sort of well-to-do white people in some nice Brooklyn brownstone or on some country estate somewhere that no one gives a shit about. And but meanwhile, you have this gritty play about working class blue collar people. And people like to see it. Or again, I come back to August Wilson, who's writing plays. They're about Black people, but they're about normal people in just extraordinary circumstances. And he did what's called the century cycle, where he wrote a play about a different decade in what he calls the Black experience. And the thing is, I had a teacher who once said, and I think it's very, very true, even though it sounds counterintuitive, that the more personal something is, the more universal it becomes. Because once you are diving into these human emotions and our human experience, our shared human experience, we can all understand what that is. And I think the great writers tap into that. And when they sort of, even if they have an agenda, like I said, Ruined might be a feminist play, but there's no, and there's a lot of male violence in that play, honestly. But there's just no way you can come away from that show and not be deeply moved by the story of these women, and also just feel like, like you just had a journey, you've been on a journey, and but so those plays are being written, but like I said, you have to have the sort of cachet and marquee value of a Lynn Nottage, and then you have to have the craft. She's a brilliant writer, even though our politics might diverge a lot, but her story craft is never overwhelmed by her politics. It informs her politics inform her writing, but they never overwhelm it. And I think there's a reason that she's one of she's such a fantastic writer. But to go back to your original question, I'm sure those plays are out there. And I'm not going to say that they never get produced, but right now in the sort of paradigm that we're in, it's really more about putting forth. I mean, right now on Broadway, they did a revival of the musical 1776, which was so woke that even the critics were bashing it. It just didn't do very well. They did. There's a show called Ain't No Mo right now. It's about, like, I think it's a Black trans person, and the Will and Jada Smith. Pinkett Smith had to buy out the rest of the run because the show was failing and it's going to close. So these are the kind of things that are being done, as opposed to work that, especially now, with things as with the economy about to just tanking and going to get worse. Now's not the time really to do these big issue plays. Now's the time you want to connect with the general public. But the problem is, you're dealing with people, and this touches on your question as well. You're dealing with people for whom the general public are a bunch of unsophisticated, unwashed masses who are racist, sexist, bigots, who need to be educated and educated out of their fascism. And that's sort of the prevalent attitude right now in many of our arts institutions. They think that the general public is stupid and they can't enjoy this work. And this goes kind of back into what you were saying, is the audience is the second part of your question. The audience is good work has an impact. I've done high school matinees of Shakespeare where, they loved it. If it's done well, it will translate clearly. I've done Brecht plays. Brecht is a notoriously difficult playwright, the Bertolt Brecht, the German playwright. His work can be very, very, very difficult. I did a play off Broadway. It was The Good Person of Szechuan. I remember opening night, the theater that produced it, does like sort of advocacy work in the community. So they had a bunch of people who frequent homeless shelters, in the front row watching the show. They loved it. They loved the show so much because it connected with them, because the storytelling was so good. We transferred it to the Public Theater, one of the most prestigious off Broadway houses in New York. And again, we had high school kids rocking out to Brecht, for God's sakes. So it's not that audiences or the general public does not have the capacity to get these works. It's that they're not trusted enough by the people producing these works. In my own experience, I'm putting out these Shakespeare sonnets. I also posted a video of myself doing a classic Rodgers and Hammerstein song. The response has been, especially with the latter, has been overwhelmingly positive. And my favorite comments were from people that were like, I have no interest in musical theater at all, or this style of singing, but I would love to see more of this because this is great work. People know what great work is when they see it. They don't need an Ivy League degree or a high IQ or whatever to know great work when they see it. And that's the bigger point that people need to remember, is that you're not an idiot. Another example. As a matter of fact, I was doing an August Wilson play called Piano Lesson in Connecticut, and we had this talk back afterward. And the lady at the talk back, again, this is the wokeness, sort of, so to speak, where she tried to make it about Black women and August Wilson. I'm like, sorry, sorry, bitch, he wasn't writing about you. He just wasn't. And people use that as a cudgel to bash the playwright, but he just wasn't writing about Black women. There are great roles for women in his plays, but he was primarily writing about men. And so in this play, The Piano Lesson, it's about this brother and sister who are fighting over this family heirloom piano. The brother wants to sell it and build his own life. It's set in the 1920s, by the way. He wants to build his own life, because his father and grandfather risked their lives to move it out of a plantation owner's house. You know what I mean? And he's like, this is my legacy. This is what they left me to build on. But the sister doesn't want to sell it because the family history is carved into the wood of the piano. So it has this great sentimental value. That's the central conflict of the play. And I remember after we had this talk back, and there was this white couple that was sort of off to the side, and I felt like the guy was kind of there because his girlfriend dragged him to the theater. And I said, Boy Willie, who's the main character, the main male character I was playing, I said, he's very unapologetic, and what I love about the character is that he goes after what he wants. And like, this white dude was there with his girlfriend. He goes, he's just like, yeah, man, he takes what he wants. He goes for it. And I said, that is the power of theater and storytelling right there. You have this play which has no white characters in it at all, about this experience, which is like probably far removed from this guy's, worldview or experience. And yet this play resonated with him. This character's journey resonated with him. So when I see these people who are just, who are like white people this or denigrating everybody, it's like, no, we need to unify people, because if your work is good, it will reach people and it will inspire people. That's the big point right now. And they're not stupid. They're not, they don't need to be improved. Just do good work and show it to them that can speak to their humanity, if not their experience. And that's what's most important. I think that's what's sort of being lost. That's my soapbox. That's my TED Talk for today.
So I just wanted to put in a little caveat here. If you're doing sonnets, if you're not aware, there are Spartan poems. They're very, very short, usually only a couple of pages, but you would definitely have the voice to do Spartan poems if you wanted a short thing to throw up to people to hear them be inspired. I think throw up some historical pictures in the background, and that would be a presentation in itself. But I just wanted to say that
I'm looking it up now.
The reason why I'm so interested in this topic is because I usually, when I'm looking at the stories that I love and the stories that I've read when I was young, and going into comic books and everything else like that, you don't realize how much they are affected by other types of media. Sometimes because, well, the things that I study is basically the origin of ideas and where they come from, and how they trace themselves through history. But when you look at older stories, the great ones that we're looking at on the screen right now that are being produced into movies, they were very much affected by television and movies and other stories, which in themselves were so much affected by the theater. Again, you go from everything from Jimmy Stewart to William Shatner. I mean, they were stage actors, and they were able to bring that presence into a television on your on your living room floor. And it's that what you talked about earlier. It's that bringing of that larger world and that larger form of touching the audience through that acting. I think that comes from the stage and trickles down into what you see on the screen and into the stories that you're going to see more and more. So that's why I'm interested in this topic very much. So we're coming up to the end of our hour, and I don't want to keep you too long, but I'll give up the floor to you to talk about the Clifton Duncan podcast or any other activity that you're currently engaged in. I know that you do some voice acting for reading of books and things like that. If you want to talk about any of that for a few minutes, you go right ahead.
Oh, sure. Thank you, RJ. Well, it's certainly been a pleasure talking to you again. But yeah, so the Clifton Duncan podcast on my YouTube channel and on Spotify. Although I'm having difficulty getting it on Apple for some reason. There's some weird thing with trying to open up an account. But it's very much an arts focused, an arts and culture focused podcast. And I've had a variety of wonderful guests. Douglas Murray, Victor Davis Hanson. We had a great half-hour conversation about the importance of Greek classics. As a matter of fact, the great R.J. Shaw, aka the Fourth Age. We talked about the the destruction of the masculine heroic ideal. I also have guests like Critical Drinker, and who's one of my most popular guests, talking about what happened to modern movies. Razor Fist, another very, very popular commentator. We talked about communism in Hollywood. So lots of really great topics about focusing on art and entertainment. And but I also have a Rumble channel, which focuses on topics that are too hot for TV or too hot for YouTube. So definitely check that out. I also have my Instagram and and also I want to shift more towards performance oriented content. I have a great little piece I filmed of myself doing a piece from Macbeth, I should say, the character of Macduff, which got a really, really great response. Like I said before, I put up the video of myself performing Rodgers and Hammerstein, got a really great response in that. So in terms of, if we want to break it down to culture war, I guess I'm sort of fighting back in terms of actually just putting out great work, like I was saying before. And it's having a really positive impact. And my audience is growing right now. I'm also on Twitter at Clifton A. Duncan. I call myself a mediocre Twitter personality, but it's kind of funny because in the past, going on 3 years now, I've amassed more of a reach and more of a following in just that short amount of time than in 10 years I did as an actor. I've become more famous for not being able to act than I have as an actor. So that's really interesting. So that's kind of what I'm up to right now. I also have a Substack called Musings from the Apocalypse, which I want to update more and just again do more writings and essays focused on art and culture. I think what the sort of slogan I'm working with now is make artists liberal again, and that's sort of what I cling to, is the label of liberal. Maybe in the classical sense, the traditional sense, but I think that's what's missing right now. I've had people come up to me and be like, we need more conservative art. And I think to myself, I can't think of anything that sounds more boring than quote unquote conservative art, whatever that even means. The preservation of a more, liberal sensibility, just open and not the sort of far left, more authoritarian, collectivist sort of deconstructionist postmodern worldview, but just straight up, liberal, free expression, valuing the individual, not, tearing ourselves away from this very nihilistic and cynical culture, which is, what's infested our industries. If you want, and no greater example of that, I think, can be found than just recently with the Velma show on HBO Max. It's very cynical. People have commented on it, just how hateful it is and how mean spirited it is. And it's like, guys, you have no idea. This is like New York and LA snark right here. They think it's funny. They think it's hilarious. And it's sort of like, it's like edgy humor. I'm going to comment on everything. I'm not going to really connect emotionally. And it's not really connecting. It's just very cynical, like I said. And we have to turn back toward this more life affirming, I think, more open, and worldview which values the human experience for what it is, warts and all, and reflects, comes back to a sense of reflecting the world that we actually see, not the world as we wish it to be. So maybe those, lofty and too pretentious, but that's kind of what I'm up to. And I think what I'm thinking of in terms of, because, we always complain. That's the last thing I'll say. We always complain about, the culture wars and how everything's, going down the tubes. But I think it's better at this point to stop talking about it and just start making work, and which you're doing as well, obviously, with your books, which look pretty awesome. But putting forth a more positive vision of the future that we can all move toward. And I think we have the technology now and the reach with guys like you, guys like me, and others who are, putting stuff out there. Stop complaining and stop saying, oh, the libs are taking over the arts and it's all bad. Like, no, just get in the game and put your stuff out there. Look at what Eric July just did, raising over $3 million for his comic book. It's possible. We can do it, and we can push back, not in an aggressive way, but just say, hey, we're doing great work, and I know it's going to resonate with you. And, and you can focus on the economics and legislation and all that kind of stuff. But, part of a well-rounded and well-lived life, I think, you need nourishment for your soul and your spirit. And that's what art can do.
Well said. And thank you very much for being here. You've certainly opened my eyes to many of the questions that I had in this vein. So I want to also thank my audience for being here to hear all of this. Hopefully your eyes are opened a little more about storytelling and how that process comes to us onto the screen and onto the stage. Tune in next week. Hopefully I'm going to have Professor Geek on with me. So we'll continue on with these conversations about storytelling and culture. So thank you once again, Clifton.
Oh, my pleasure, Rajay.
So if this interview has given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you want to add to this conversation. And don't forget, the links are in the description, both for my 2 superhero graphic novels, The Valiant Heroes and Thomas Valiant, and also the link for the early bird sign-up page for Crom the Destroyer. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.